just want to stress to everybody that it is the challenge of American society today. And the notion of civility has been discussed and is really as ancient as civilized society. And the issue is really how people interrelate in community. Civility is not about simply or principally about manners. It doesn't mean that advocacy, particularly spirited advocacy, isn't important. Indeed, if you think about argumentation, it's a social good. And if you don't have argumentation, there's a tendency to dogmatism, and in politics, possibly even tyranny. And so the way I look at the civility issue, it's all about expanding argumentation rather than contracting it. Because if you get too uncivil, someone either can't hear or doesn't want to hear. And that means that one doesn't really get the benefit of what someone else might be thinking. And I want to give a definition of civility, partly because I mentioned the idea of the Dictionary of Regional American English, because I'm confident you'd get a different definition almost anywhere in the country. But it's a really important conceptualization because of those that are tempted to start out saying that civility is about manners. And that's why I put a lot of time into coming up with a definition. I'm going to read it real quickly to you. In interpersonal relations, civility is the paying of respectful attention to others. In politics, it's the recognition that collective decision-making requires open-minded consideration of the views and concerns of all citizens, with an understanding that no individual party or political movement has a monopoly on knowledge, virtue, or judgment. In relations between states, civility requires respect for other cultures and customs, with the understanding that there are limits to respect when basic norms like aggression, coercion, corruption, and integrity are at issue. And at all levels, there must be an understanding that each of us individually and collectively affect and rely on each other. No individual or country is an island sheltered from the ripples of nature and fellow man. Now, this notion of civility is fundamental to the Declaration of Independence and our Constitution-based democracy. The concept that all men are created equal doesn't mean that all thoughts are equally meritorious. And nevertheless, if all men are equal in the public realm, it does imply that everyone's concerns are worthy of consideration. The problem comes when rancorous rhetoric is manipulated to divide the American family. And words reflect emotion as well as meaning, and they clarify or cloud thought and energize action, which can, basically speaking, bring out the better angels of our nature or the more basic instincts. Higher moments almost always in our history, although there are lots of exceptions, have often been characterized by expansions of political tolerance, and lower moments by debilitating discourse that's accentuated by racial, ethnic, or religious bigotry. In our history, and people have been probing this in the last year, there have clearly been worse periods than this one, and more troubling challenges. And in world affairs, many more egregious words have been used to incite people to greater misdeeds than we're looking at today. Nevertheless, if you take the American political discourse today, one of the interesting things is to ask if certain words really fit. And for example, if you suggest that someone is a fascist, if you suggest someone is a communist, what does that mean? If you suggest someone is a socialist, and whether one likes any policy or not of this president, it's interesting to say if you say he's a socialist, he's advocating a tax level less than half the tax level that was advocated by Dwight David Eisenhower. And so is Ike a super socialist? And the answer is no. And that doesn't mean that one should support or oppose any policy any candidate or any office holder would take today. But One of the great dangers when you get beyond socialism, you talk about fascism or communism, and if you ask, what is fascism? And you think of a dictatorship, a totalitarian system that brought us concentration camps. Well, is there anyone in American politics today that's favoring concentration camps? And I don't know a soul. And so it shouldn't fit America's vocabulary. If you take communism, you're talking about gulags. And by the way, in the 1930s, when they had these great liquidations of peoples, particularly owners of farmland, but the highest percentage people killed in the Soviet Union were members of the Communist Party killing themselves. It was a structure in which, to get ahead, you had the option to kill. Well, does that define anybody in America today? And I just raise this because when people use words like this, you have to ask yourself, is it appropriate to use words that are warring words? We lost 400,000 Americans to defeat fascism, tens of thousands to hold communism at bay, and then some people have used words like secession. Well, we fought a civil war to preserve and strengthen a union. 600,000 people were killed. And so, is this a word that fits our times? And that is why it's so important that we think about not just whether we favor or oppose particular tax or tax cut initiatives, but what is the meaning behind people on the other side of these issues, and can't they be respected? And if they can't be respected, how does a country come together to make decisions? And right now, one of the words that's defining Washington, D.C. is dysfunctional, when you look at Capitol Hill particularly. And is there any reason for that? When I entered the United States Congress, among other things, other people, I served under a great Speaker of the House named Tip O'Neill. Tip was one of the most partisan individuals of the time, and yet he was one of the fairest individuals of the time. And one of the great friendships of an era was Thomas P. Tip O'Neill, the liberal Democrat from Massachusetts, and Ronald Reagan, the conservative president from California. They truly liked each other. One of the great stories, when Ronald Reagan was shot, and he came closer to death than the American people ever knew, his first visitor outside the family was Tip O'Neill. And he got down on his knees and he kissed his hand. That's really profound. Now, how many think that that attitude characterizes our government today? I mean, this is a really important moment in our history. The poet Walt Whitman once described our country as an athletic democracy, and he didn't mean by that anything about sports. He was talking about the ruggedness and the vigor of the 19th century, and we had these great divisions, particularly slavery. And we had this famous event in 1804 where the Vice President of the United States of America shot dead in a duel our greatest Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, all based on Hamilton calling Aaron Burr despicable. And then half a century later, a House member wandered over to the Senate and caned almost to death a United States Senator who had criticized his uncle in the context of criticizing something called the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which implied that slavery could be brought west of the Mississippi River. But these were moments that were pretty extraordinary. And what's new today is that we've got transforming changes in communications technology, in American politics, and the issues facing the world. And I'm just going to conclude with this, that in Western civilization, our most prophetic poem is something called The Second Coming by William Butler Yeats. And Yeats suggested that the center cannot hold when the best lack all conviction and the worst are full of passionate intensity. And he was talking about trench warfare in World War I and relating back to it in this great poem. But there are elements of this that fit our times in a very different kind of way. And so when we think about American politics and the words being used, I think it's a time for great caution. And I'm going to end with a commentary that I've seen very close up. And it comes back to some of the most uncivil things happening in the American political system are described in very polite ways. And on a daily basis, if you take the United States Congress, when votes are held, people walk from their offices to the House floor. And on the way, there are people that are milling about. And they're very nice individuals with nice families, but their job is to lobby. And they will come up to a member walking to the floor and say things like, "Say, Joe, you know, we maxed out our support for you in the last election, and we hope to even match it more in the next election. But we have this great vote coming up tomorrow, and we hope you'll be with us. And by the way, how's your wife, Sally, and the kids?" It's an incredibly polite conversation, but implicit is absolute utter coercion. And it's all about money and politics. And now we have a Supreme Court that's moved in the direction of suggesting that corporations are individuals and therefore can enter the political fray to a greater extent. And now we have a circumstance that every calculus of every political figure in a legislative body of any serious dimension has to think through, without saying anything to his friends, his staff, but just to himself. If I take a stand on this issue, will this draw attention to me from a force with money out there? And will that affect my vote? Will it affect my speech? And aren't I better, even if I stick with my convictions where I might want to vote, to do it quietly? Or maybe I should throw a vote to these guys. And the case, to me, for radical campaign reform is absolutely overwhelming. And it's one of the great civility issues of our time, because it's all about the concept of democracy. Do we want a system that relates to individual voters, or a system that relates to the few people that know how to influence those individual voters? All I can say is that civilization, and the bottom line is, requires civility, and civility requires decent manners some of the time, most of the time, but decent ways of listening and really profound ways of making individual independent decisions unrelated to conflicts of interest that are not in any sense illegal. They're just outside the norm of what you're supposed to think of, which is the greater good of the greater society. Thank you all.